Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge and I'm your host. I am the author of 12 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. Most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal coaching success, the role of experience, optimal performance practices and outcomes in the real world, with over 60 episodes to date. Today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent to coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So, as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today. Whether you're new or you have been with us for some time now, thank you so much. This is only the second episode now since my 12th book has been released, which is How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking, which I'm hopeful to most of you is of no surprise, since I'm quite confident that over the past almost 6 months, that has, let's say, subliminally been shared on a very frequent basis. But I think if you have not grabbed your copy yet, please do. You should have just enough time to grab it in time for Christmas, because it's only a few days away now. But don't worry, if you do miss out in time for Christmas, you will get it in time for the start of the 2024 season, which, as we all know, is just around the corner, which is equally incredibly exciting. But today's episode, I wanted to focus on a few key parts to really run home some new or key insights from how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking with the 8th key with the 2024 season coming, because we've got a few indicators I'm happy to share now on the current top 10, if they're going to be maintaining their hold inside the top 10 this coming season, who to watch out for. But also I wanted to take the opportunity to share a few insights which I don't normally do from, let's just say, a few snippets that I've picked up on social media, various platforms, and a couple of, like, let's say, information, tips, techniques being shared that actually goes against the grain. And by that I mean that if you begin to adopt these techniques, you're actually doing yourself more harm than good. So it's a little bit different, because the previous episodes we focused on the WTA finals, the ATP finals, and the launch of my latest book, which of course I am so ecstatic about. And on that note, I think it's also exciting to share that even though these episodes are recorded in advance, not too far in advance though, because it's still a little bit more than a fortnight before Christmas, because we have been under the pump with the launch of this book, which again is incredibly exciting. But also it marks today, in fact, 9 years since I submitted my doctoral dissertation, which marks a significant milestone because it has been a continuous work in progress, which is shared in this latest text about why it has taken 11 years from its initial inception to 8 years in the making, and why it was only released now, why the other 11 books had to be released first. And I'm sure each and every one of you can understand that writing, let alone one book, is an incredibly exhaustive task. And so to be able to put that time away, I mean, typically it would take a much longer time period to push out 12 books in 8 years. So that just goes to show, I hope, for each and every one of you out there, my commitment to again, each and every one of you that aspires to head towards the top 10 and develop that top 10 tennis ranking, because the foundations really need to be put in place, because if they weren't, it would have been a disservice to essentially the data, the research, the science, the ATP and WTA tour coaches we'd worked with, and the ATP WTA players over this expansive period of time, which really goes to, I think, underscore the enormity of this work, but also the importance of science, to make sure it wasn't subjective, so to make sure it wasn't about one opinion or the other opinions. It's actually really interesting, I think, because for the very first time, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking unveils the discrepancies there, the differences that really are big differences between coaches at the elite level. And what we've found and is unraveled in this book is that 92%, and I'll say that again because it's absolutely staggering, 92% of coaches on the ATP and WTA tour do not know, which means that the likelihood of a developmental coach, the coach at your local academy, knowing is incredibly scarce. It's really limited, and that is because this is new knowledge and new practices, and more often than not, there's only 8% of coaches out there and players out there that know and that are continuously upkeeping this level of play, this level of coaching pedagogy. We frame that as, because they're really inadvertent, intentional practices that are established between coach and player to work as a team to build that ultimate endpoint. So we also know, for example, why one coach and athlete can be so incredibly successful as that relationship blossoms. And we also know then when that player moves on to another coach, and when that coach moves on to another player, why those results are not as successful. For example, how come one coach could win, 2, 3, 5 plus Grand Slams with one player, and with another player they can't? So it's really interesting, and I think it serves a really important message to a lot of players out there, whether you are top 100, top 50, top 20, or even top 10, because when it comes time to look for that next coach, that right coach for you, it's really important not to base that off specific results in a number of respects. Just because one coach was able to win a Grand Slam with one player doesn't necessarily mean that's the case for you. As much as that's what you want, the best part about how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking, it actually guides you how to win that maiden Grand Slam. It actually showcases why some top 10 players have won a Grand Slam and some more than one Grand Slam, but also I think more fundamentally why a number of top 10 players have not won a Grand Slam, or why a number of top 10 players throughout their careers that they are able to maintain a level of play inside the top 10, but still never able to win a Grand Slam, which can be incredibly disheartening by all accounts, because I think a top 10 ranking is seen as step one, and step two then is obviously that Grand Slam accomplishment, and the more the merrier in a manner of speaking. But that's not factored in to obviously that end goal, to sustaining a level of play, achieving the likes of replicated success, implementing the golden rule, being privy to the 8 keys, integrating the initial 7 to begin with, so the 8 key then becomes amplified. How this all works together, why they were labeled as keys to begin with, how there's a language model in a manner of speaking that really ramps up how an individual learns. Now, it's really important, I think, here to run home that humanized approach, because when we're considering that humanized approach, it's important to recall that each and every player and or athlete is an individual. We are all human, but it also means we all learn in different ways, and this is really important. And again, this book really shows you how and explains this to you in a lot more detail. But what we're sharing here is that how one coach perceives how one player learns, and if they move on to another player and they use the same approach, they're not going to succeed. And the same is applicable for how that coach interprets and learns from a player, because of course it should be reciprocal in this respect. And if it is not the same as their previous player, it's not going to work. So there's going to be a lot of missing pieces. So it's really about how do we fill these gaps. So when we're looking at the individual, that humanized approach, it's akin to everyday life, whether you are in that professional environment, what you're learning, who you're mentoring, and or if you're that student, are you, I think, perceiving that teacher in the given context, and so on and so forth, which is a really key ingredient here. Now, I think what has encouraged me in a way, before we shift to, I think, today's topic later on, is that when I'm looking through so many pieces of social media, I'm looking at how athletes are getting misguided, how they're getting injured, because there's so much information out there, and it's more of a case, who do I listen to? Now, the more concerning part is we have coaches who, by all accounts, are very good coaches in their own right. But the concern here is that just because they've achieved really solid success with one player does not mean these key practices are transferable to each and every individual. They of course have specific merits, but when you're looking at a baseline technique, we really need to be mindful of the body as a whole. Now, I do have blog posts about this. We've got earlier episodes on this. But if you're teaching a child, a player, an athlete a new technique, and you are not accommodating that whole body, if you're not accounting for how their knees should be bending, that angle at their hips to lower their center of gravity, to push them into the court, that level of momentum, a lot of problems begin. The serve is a wonderful example, because a lot of athletes look at power, and if the ball's in, as success. But if they're not using their lower body, they're more often than not, their upper body is muscling the ball, which means there's an increased load then on the upper body. And over time, if you're not using the likes of torque to momentum, to taking advantage of your elastic energy, if you're not really understanding how your kinetic chain works and getting the most out of it, essentially you're going to break down. There's going to be a kink in that chain. Now, one of my texts at the Science of Elite Performance really dives into that. But more often than not, a lot of coaches on tour, because recall, we're really focusing 92%, and the data says this, do not know, which means a lot of them may potentially be not picking up injuries or potential techniques / integrations or modifications within their player's game that could potentially lead to an injury later on, if not exacerbate a current injury. Or when you're giving advice to the general public online, and if you're not factoring in, I think, these differences, it can be quite concerning. One of, I think, the most concerning facets at the moment that I've come across is seeing a lot of juniors hitting the ball really well. And as a ballpark, let's keep it for 12 years and under, even though I view juniors a lot older as well. But we can look at this age range and I go, okay, they're really hitting the ball quite smoothly with their racket. But then what I also see as this young child hitting the ball nice and cleanly is that more often than not, the ball is higher, and it is way too high for their lower body to come into play. So at the end of the day, they're really controlling the ball with their upper body. Now, if this is what a child is developing, so recall previous episodes when we've touched on that 10,000 ball analogy, etc. And what happens when you ingrain a certain technique and the child is more malleable in this manner of speaking. So the more adaptable, think flexible, they're less likely to develop an injury at that age. But as soon as adolescent cracks in and they start, from 15, 16, 17, and they've been using this technique for the last 2, 3, 4 years, that's when the pain happens, and that's what causes a career to end. Or it also what halts those peak performance cycles that we've touched on previously. And with all the content that I'm seeing online, this is not being picked up. It's essentially being encouraged, which means that what currently is happening is going to continue. But if we want to move the game to the next level, if we want to protect children and players and allow them, let's say with that roadmap to progress towards that top 10 tennis ranking, then we need to be able to share with them how or what steps do they need to mitigate these potential challenges. Now look, it's nothing to say that a young player cannot hit the ball in this way. Of course they can, but you need to accommodate that whole body. You can't just condition that child, that athlete, that player lopsided, so where it's just one side. Now, I've seen a couple of videos lately of college players. Now, those of you who are familiar with my background is that, yes, I can put my hand up that I've been there. Now, we know that there are some really great players that can come out of playing college tennis or the NCAA, for example. But that is not to say that their coaching background is synonymous with that. Now, I've touched on this before. We all know, or hopefully we understand what a coaching qualification is and or what a coaching accreditation is. But just to be clear, you've got your different levels out there. So you got typically in Australia, it's 1, 2, 3, and I think the States to Europe goes 1 to 5. But they're essentially a 3 in Australia is synonymous with a 5. But it's so important to remember it's a certification. It is by no means an undergraduate degree. So for those of you who are not aware, I am a level 3 and I have been a level 3 for almost 20 years. I did it very young, but also I was one of the coaches permitted to go back to back because I was that fortunate / exceptional in my own right, that I had a really innate ability to know the landscape essentially of tennis, because I think I've been immersed in it for an extended amount of time. Now, on top of that was obviously that undergraduate degree, but also my master's. Now, my master's especially was in sports coaching, looking at elite performance, elite athletes, looking at high performance, but specifically the biomechanics, the sports science, the physiology, everything wrapped into it. So think biomechanics, exercise science, elite performance, high performance, how you build that whole athlete. Now, different, I think, postgraduate programs allow you to specialize as you please with different, I think, frameworks. I was very fortunate to be able to specialize how I pleased in this respect because of my background already at that time. And then, but that's not enough, right? That I went on to do my doctorate. And when we're looking at that, we're really coupling in that how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking is one of the many outputs of that doctorate, that it was that extensive. And oh my goodness, do I have stories from that. So I'm sharing that when you see someone giving you advice, just be careful, because we know that this information, for example, this new knowledge is not in coach education frameworks. That is why I continue to investigate, I continue to research, I continue to look at different, I think, scientific implications and findings, and really investigate what was going on, what needs to happen to rebuild an educational framework to allow coaches to succeed and players to succeed whilst mitigating injuries. Because a lot of, I think, the teachings and learnings in these frameworks set players and coaches up to fail. And by fail, I mean to develop injuries. They do not understand and or teach coaches within these baseline levels how to mitigate injuries. And that's really important, and how the body works and how techniques really have a role to play, and how my body of work has been responsible for establishing a new technique. So when you use this new technique, some of you, if you've read my work, you are familiar with the V by Dr. Berge. And this latest text really shares, I think, greater insights on its implications in the best possible way, because it is directly correlated with a top 10 tennis ranking. And we've got those key indicators we look at to build the 8%. So what separates the 92% to the 8%? Now, one of, I think, the key training tools that I absolutely love to see is when I see a player hitting against a wall. But we really need to be mindful of the technique, because if you are practicing your forehand, your backhand, your serve, your volley, irrespective, the wall is your best friend. I can put my hand up and say I was one of those players, and the wall definitely was my best friend at that time. And I could stay against it for hours, but it becomes quite problematic when your technique isn't as such as you would like. Now, fortunately, these days, you do have the capacity to leverage, I think, your mobile and your camera. In an ironic way, back when I was playing, that was a lot more harder to come by, because we did not have the cameras on our phones that were as accessible. But now what you can do, and I really would encourage most players, if not all coaches and players to do, is to use that camera, obviously with the guided permissions when and or if necessary, just to tweak your technique, especially if you are by yourself hitting against that wall, so you can modify it. Because something that I've come across over the last 20 plus years is that when I'm working with players or our athletes and they think they are activating their lower body, they're really not. And I can put my hand up being guilty of this many years ago as well. Or even when I've been showing players and it feels like that. And for me personally, it feels like that because I have very tight hamstrings, so it doesn't take much to feel like that I'm sitting a lot lower. But that is not the case for the tennis player. We want that body, lower body activated alongside the upper body. And that is very problematic when we see players who are incredibly lopsided. And there is a key warning sign that I can see, if not in every single social media post that I see here, whether it is your ground stroke or your serve, is that I would argue that 99% of developing players, so I'll underscore developing here, so let's say top 50 in the world, because developing comes in, I think, in different phases, and we do have episodes around that as well. So, but I see the upper body being primarily prioritized, so favored, without that lower body being activated, which is really concerning. Because if you want to set a player up for success long term, there's one primary key metric that I've talked about and evolved within my text, and that really comes down to the ability of activating your lower body. One of the most exciting facets here is that the likes of Swiatek, Mikova, Alcaraz, Sinner, and Rune, and there are a handful of others, of course, have progressed from starting the year, for example, around 180 in the world, and ending the year inside the top 20 and or top 10 the same year, because one of those key indicators that I've spoken about throughout this extensive body of work is that they have the capacity to activate their lower body. Now, players who do not activate their lower body, that does not happen. And we have the data that underscores that. So it's really important to learn. What happens though, if you are not learning how to activate your lower body within that developmental age range, so whether it's 12 and under or from that 14, 15, 16 plus, what happens as you develop, that lower body is lagging. It becomes harder and harder to ingrain, harder and harder to reach what we term as a habitual state of play, and to build in then those patterns of play that again we've touched on in previous episodes. So it's sharing, if you want to make it easier, if you want to ascend towards the top 10 easier, if you want a top 10 tennis ranking and you want to get there sooner, in a more fluid way, less problematic, that's a lot more easier to ingrain specific discrete skills, to build those serial skills that obviously we need to build those techniques. And if you want that pathway and to be able to follow it throughout the long game, so the terms that are quite familiar on AMA International, this pathway then is for you. Because if you want to do it the hard way, and I need to put my hand up, no one likes doing it the hard way, and I think that's the best part about how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking, because it really unveils for the first time, and now the first time in history of sport, it is that substantial, that exciting, is that it really underscores these key principles on how to progress towards the top 8% in the world. Now, the best part is that it really runs home that it's not just tennis, even though it's really highlighting tennis, similar to my previous text, which was the 7 keys to optimize your life, and using tennis to develop behaviors that deliver optimal performances in play and in life, which I don't typically share, but that's really what those 7 keys are about. It's all about tennis, but then how it transfers in life and or other sports. Now, the 8 keys here, or how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking, the power of the 8th key, really runs home. It's all about tennis and data and an interwoven story that's discussed. but more so the Olympic correlations. So what I mean by that, if you're capable of establishing a level of play synonymous with the top 8% in the world, we know how to push those markers further and set you up for further progress. And by that time we're looking at a podium finish. So we're looking at the Olympic correlation where it's gold, silver, bronze, how to build and achieve those incremental markers that work for you to achieve that. And the best part is that it's underpinned by science. Now there are a lot of skeptics out there, and I've touched on this in the past previous episode, and even it is touched on in the book, about that there are a lot of people, unfortunately, who may not understand this, or they fear it because they've been scared it. So they have unfortunately been trying to stop this for roughly the past decade or more, and which has been a shame, and it's been quite a load that I've taken as well. But I really want to make sure that this was available, because I knew what it was like when I was that 13-year-old not having access to this and then suffering injury after injury. But what this is really about is that if you don't understand science, that's okay. If you're one of those coaches that has that baseline qualification and or accreditation, this is going to amplify your game. It's not making you go to university. It's not making you do that bachelor's, that undergraduate degree, that master's, the postgraduate studies, because I've already done that for you. What this is giving to you is how to achieve your end point, how to develop a top 10 tennis player and achieve that top 10 tennis ranking. That's how exciting it is. And of course I could say, I wish I was in your shoes, that maybe I didn't spend the last almost 15 plus years investigating this and looking into this, but someone had to. It was not there. These were gaps that I recognized very early on, that were not being shared, were not accessible. They were not in any textbook, they were not online. And I think one of my most recent posts has been about OpenAI to ChatGPT to Facebook. We know that they store an enormous amount of knowledge. So if you put into either of any of them how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking, it doesn't exist, because this is new. This is absolutely new scientific knowledge that has been built. But I will preface that if something does come out, it's not scientific, so it's not backed by data and science. And so to underscore that, we've spoke from a quantitative perspective for more than 150,000 inferences, and now we're sharing the qualitative insights based on players and coaches at the elite echelon of play, so on the ATP and or WTA tour, and their dispersion to level of knowledge and the gaps there as well, and how it feeds into that quantitative data. So this is getting a bit complex then. Obviously, if you are a science nut, you understand obviously how I think each respective methodology works and interplays to, I think, investigate and or unravel what you're looking for. So for argument's sake, you could say a hypothesis. But what I'm really talking about here is that how a lot of scientific rigor has been involved here, and there's just been a lot of data and a lot of unraveling, and how I think the nature of inquiry works. So the nature of science has been established for, it seems like, millennia. And is that we leverage, I think, for lack of better wording, these pathways that need to be followed in these processes to unravel this, which means, again, running home that it's not opinionated. And then coming full circle then is that what I see on social media is that it's often opinionated, and we see a lot of tips, and I'm actually on one of the social media platforms now looking at players giving tips And the most concerning part for me is that they have a lot of views. And when I say a lot of views, we're looking at in the millions. And so it's sharing that when we're looking at building the next generation of play, if you use this knowledge, unfortunately, you're going to maintain your current pace, your current level of play. However, if you want to embark on the next generation of play, be privy to the next generation of play, that is where the 7 keys come into play. And now this new 8th key really ramps it home. All right, I think that was a lot to begin with, really sharing some key insights from this latest book, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking, The Power of the 8th Key, and how it really, I think, has some really solid touch points on, let's say, a lot of information being shared on social media, irrespective of what level that player is. But then also, well, if we're looking at players who are inside the top 100 or 200 who are looking to embark and progress towards that top tennis ranking, here are your answers. Now, there are a lot of key players, for example, who have recently regressed from being inside the top 10. One player as such is Raducanu, who's, I want to say, is ranked in the 200s at the moment. Or we've got a Kyrgios, for example. Both have been regressed because of their injuries, or they're battled with injuries, unfortunately. Now, we can fast track their ascension back towards the top 20 with these key metrics. You've got players from the likes of Azarenka to Kenin, who have both obviously won Grand Slams in their own right. Azarenka actually has been steadily looking around that top 20 mark, and it's definitely a dark horse there. Kenin, however, has that capacity, or you can look at a Collins, to progress further, and Makova, who can progress further. And one of my favorites, I think, is Shelton, has really been progressing this past year, who's a bit of a dark horse, I think, in this respect. But there are also, current top 10 players to the likes of Rublev, for example, who is quite dangerous. Monfils, for example, has the capacity to pair it with Svitolina in the best possible way to ramp up his capacity to join the top 10 once again. Because these are just merely examples of some players who are coming to mind who have the capacity to really push deeper. Now, by all accounts, there are a number of players. There were obviously ATP, WTA tours. There's 200 players combined inside that top 100 ranking range. Now, we can break down 200 players. 92% of them do not know. 8% of them do, which means that's 16 players all up. Now, these 16 should be making the round of 16. However, that's not always the case. So there are certain markers. Then what is your game missing? What is your game missing now? And what is your game missing to win the series? So that's 3 texts. Really underscores this. They were published roughly 2-3 years ago now. So they are based on specific metrics then, which our last 2 texts now have built upon. That really brings that home. So as a complete collection, it really, I think, showcases how you can look at metrics on the ATP and WTA Tour, how you can implement then the 7 keys to the I Am Your Tennis Coaching Guru, so we can't forget that, to the Science of Elite Performance, and now the latest text, which is, by the time this episode comes to air, only been out for 1 week, which is incredible. So how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking is for you if you are a tennis player and or coach on the ATP and or WTA Tour, or that is where you aspire to be. So if you are a player or coach who aspires to progress towards the top 10, irrespective if you do not have a ranking or you are top 10 at your local tennis club. It does not matter. The pathway's there for you. I think that's the most exciting part, but that it was also the most challenging part to make sure it was written to accommodate you. And also for that top 10 player to hold on to their top 10 tennis ranking for you. So being able to do that has been quite complex. So I'm sure you've heard me over the last couple of months share that, but also that I wasn't sure that this book was going to be published this year because it was such an incredible challenge. I like to think, in a manner of speaking, that by sharing, I think, these thoughts over the course of the last 60 episodes, that each and every one of you have inadvertently helped push me a little bit further. Okay, so before we close out today's episode, we have enough time, thankfully, because I did get a little bit carried away, to touch on today's topic, which is training for your environment surface changes. If you'd like to follow along, we are on page 95. Okay, so before I start sharing, I think, key insights from today's chapter, it's really important to give a little bit of a background. And by background, I'm specifically talking about a number of texts that I've penned to date that have looked at surface correlations. So what I mean by that is, does a player's technique specifically need to change and or adapt depending on the surface? Now, overwhelmingly, and we're obviously looking at the data here, the answer will surprise you, because it is no. And this is one of the biggest, I think, myths / something that has been fabricated that is not the case. And that really underscores why the likes of Djokovic, Nadal to Federer and Serena, so the top 4 that I've touched on previously, have been able to win Grand Slams on all surfaces, or almost all surfaces. However, the biggest, I think, concern / what is not discussed is the other side, not necessarily the technical implications, but the movement implications, which means the player's ability to respond to the ball, to anticipate the ball, to react to the ball, to place the ball where it needs to go, to allow them either more time or to take more time away from their opponent. So it really comes down to gameplay, positioning. So recall how we've touched on patterns of play, reaching those next peak performance cycles. So it's really understanding the story, in a manner of speaking, of that surface. You can look at grass court, for example, and how it really, I think, forces the player to activate their lower body. Now, if that lower body is not activated, you will end up losing in earlier rounds. You can look at the French Open, which does also rely on activating the lower body. However, it is almost a contrast in respect to speed when we're looking at surface correlations and Wimbledon, because you do have more time, which everyone, I think, is aware of, which means your craftiness, your ability to understand the game and your ability to respond to the ball. However, it's really important to keep in mind that your technique does not change. Your response time changes. Your anticipation changes. Your reactivity changes. And these are key proponents of a player's game that really need to be attended to. And if you do not have the ability to move as quick and fast and as steadily on these surfaces, you will lose in earlier rounds. which brings us to the hard court. So irrespective, I'm going to couple the US Open and Australian Open in one, because there is an argument out there that the US Open may be slightly faster, and then the Australian Open, you're factoring in the humidity, so typically the balls are felt as heavier. But these are just ballpark examples, because there have been a number of changes with the balls of late that have been, I think, shared openly, and been a lot of concerns with players on both tours in this respect. So we are yet to see, obviously, with the Australian Open. Well, actually, it is about 5 weeks away now. By the time this goes to air, roughly around 4 weeks away, which is, oh my goodness, it is just around the corner. But it's so important to share. These technical implications are absolutely fundamental across all 4 surfaces. If you want to win a Grand Slam, these technical implications need to be ingrained in your game. If you want to secure a top 10 tennis ranking, these technical implications and all 8 keys need to be implemented into your game, so it does not change anything. What changes, however, is if you have the capacity and mindset of that top 10 tennis player to respond accordingly, to react accordingly, to position yourself accordingly. Now, a very big misconception here is that to take the ball on the rise. That is not the case, because it depends on your level of interpretation. Take the ball on the rise when it's just bounced, or take the ball on the rise when it's about to bounce over your shoulders. Which one? Now, when we're looking at the data and obviously the technical implications, we know which one. And so we know if you need to activate your lower body. The question for you is, if you hit the ball above your head and or at your shoulders, are you activating your lower body? Now, we all know the answer, because we need to be familiar with the role of our center of gravity. Where is your center of gravity? How do you utilize your center of gravity? And so we're really looking at, obviously, amplifying and leveraging our kinetic chain here. Now, I'm really trying, and I quite frequently try not to, bring the scientific jargon into discussion here, because the text, the Science of Elite Performance, really unveils that and goes into a lot of detail. So what we have done since then, which has been over the last couple of years, is explain, the other side, and that does obviously go into the anticipation, how to build that. But we're looking at the technical implications specifically that a player needs to build to not only maintain and or ascend towards a top 10 tennis ranking, but we're looking at how do they win their maiden Grand Slam championship. So back to the Australian Open, to the US Open, and obviously they're quite different to the French Open and or Wimbledon. And when you're looking at these surfaces, the time a player has is less, so it really relies on their ability to anticipate and or react, but it really also relies on their positioning. Now, to be able to win a point at this level, and within, more often than not, these temperatures, specifically at the Australian Open, you need a certain level of stamina. But irrespective if you've got the anticipation, your reactivity to the agility, if you do not have these specific technical implications, you're going to fall by the wayside. One of these key examples is the recent players who have won, for example, the Australian Open and or US Open, and have fallen, so they've regressed. Now, I'm not going to name names here, but we see players absolutely peak, and again, I've written about this as well, and then they're nowhere to be found for the rest of the season, or not at that same level and or caliber of play. But we understand why, because you can peak, but if you have not done the work to, maintain or sustain those peak performance cycles, it's a given. Now, it really is about, when the Australian Open it starts, who's put in the work and who's able to maintain it, who has mastered that periodization, so that chart work, to ensure they're peaking at the right time, but who has ingrained those key technical implications. If you do not have them ingrained, you will fall by the wayside. Now, but we're specifically looking at top 10 and those technical implications. If you're a top 10 player and those technical implications are less than, then you're more susceptible to succumbing then to the 92%. You're going to lose your hold on the 8%. So this latest book really underscores and shares why. Now, on that, we can also talk about the 8%. How do you maintain the 8%? You need, obviously, the technical implications that I've touched on, but more so your reactivity and your ability to anticipate. Now, if you are integrating these key technical parameters, it's almost a given, which means you're more fluidly able to anticipate, you're more fluidly able to react. You are that whole player who's capable then of maintaining their hold inside the 8%. So it's almost like your own love story in a manner of speaking, because you're putting in the work, you're looking after these key components of your game, and you're merging the best of both worlds. All right, before we wrap today's episode up, just here's a key part from this initial chapter. When considering the environment where a sport is based, the surface where and on it is played is often accepted and taken as the norm. Yet some surfaces can do more harm than good to the body if their impact and ultimate influences are not taken into consideration during and throughout the training process. Not all sports are played on different surfaces, yet when children want to play, they play regardless of the surface they have available to play in and on. So without elaborating further, that is just the initial paragraph to this chapter, what it really talks about is that if you are learning to play a sport on clay and or grass, it does not matter. What matters is that you're getting those key technical foundations right. You are instilling them into your game, and then irrespective of the surface, you're able to maintain them. Now, more often than not, what happens in the junior play is that they cannot maintain them, which means the ball on grass may bounce towards their hip, but as soon as they go to a hard court surface, it bounces on their shoulder. So then they're hitting it at their shoulder. So they're going from, anyway, it varies. Now, I'm saying that in a very dismissive almost way, because this is really elaborated in these texts, but more so, it's a fault. It's almost like a fault line. It's such a severe cause for injuries within this age range that is not picked up. Because I cannot tell you how many academies, centres, clubs I've been at, whether it's Australia, Europe, North America, that continue to allow these practices to prevail. And even more so from what I've been sharing on social media, when I see players, irrespective of what age range, all of them are actually quite solid in their game. So they obviously visually look like they can play the game of tennis at quite a high level. But when I'm looking at their technique, I can see injuries and or the capacity to not activate their lower body. So if there's any takeaway from today's episode, please remember lower body and activation, and then also to learn the differentiator from the 92% to the 8%. We really need to just grab a hold of and immerse yourself in, please, how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. And obviously on the other side, that if you have been listening to us for some time now, I'd absolutely love your support. If you understand the power of science, I'd absolutely love your support as well. And feedback's always welcome, just to be able to share, but also play your part and help join that next generation of play who are really equipped with the right tools to not only mitigate injuries, but steadily progress and ascend towards that top 10 tennis ranking. Thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like we really wrapped today's episode up quite quickly because, to be honest, I looked at the time and I thought, oh my goodness, this is getting quite extensive. So I just wanted to still take a bit of a peek at the chapter and to share, I think, those surface correlations and typical misconceptions there. But also, it's so important to remember on today's episode, social media and coaching advice, just take caution. Be very mindful of that, especially if your goal is to ascend towards the top 10 tennis ranking, because a lot of the content out there could potentially do you more harm than good. So just be very mindful of that. If you are a recreational and or social player and you're just looking at different tips or tricks, then by all means. But when we're looking at the seriousness of progressing and or ascending towards the top 500, top 200, top 80, top 50, top 20, and then eventually top 10, we really want to look after, I think, that whole athlete, that whole player, and put in, I think, the key steps that we know to make sure you don't succumb to injury. And I think we've seen a lot of players the last couple of years especially succumb to those injuries because their performance indicators have not been aligning. To learn more about that, definitely look at the What Is Your Game Missing series, because it really does elaborate on that. But then more so, obviously, the 7 keys to optimize your life, and more so now my latest release, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking. Look, to grab your copy of, I think, this book that we're focusing on, ironically, The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success, head on over to AIMA International. But of course, to grab your copy of my new release, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking, you can also find it on AIMA International or Amazon. So depending where you're based in the world, whichever is easier, please, it does not matter, it does not bother me in any way, shape or form, to head on over to AIMA International or Amazon and it will be there. And I'm so excited and I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback and your thoughts, but more so setting you up solidly for that 2024 season, because here we come. For any comments or questions, head to AIMA International or topic thread, the social platforms set on data privacy. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads or Instagram. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. And to catch up on our blogs, head on over to AIMA International and look for our blog tab, or head on over to Medium. And as always, I will leave all the links in the episode notes. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. To view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify if you're listening on one of the other many platforms out there. Or for something left of field, visit Spruik for some random polls. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above would be absolutely phenomenal. For those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AIMA International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to optimize your performance and to nudge you closer towards that top 10 tennis ranking. So don't be shy and come and say hi. But I must say, and I must underscore that, How to Develop a Top 10 Tennis Ranking is for you. It is an absolute must read prior to progressing any work with myself, because those answers and that understanding, that knowledge base is absolutely fundamental for your journey to a top 10 tennis ranking and or your next Grand Slam championship. On that note, thank you so much for listening. I am so incredibly grateful. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.